Hey, Matt.
Hi, Ross.
So we're here on day one of your hiatus from blogging, but your commitment to the medium is so great that you're doing a blogging head session anyway. I think that's really
exactly.
impressive.
It's not blogging. It's web video.
It's web video, right? It's totally different.
It's completely different. Completely different. I spent it's just been the weekend off so far, really, but still, it was sort of a relief not to need to kind of drag myself up on Sunday morning and come up with something to say.
Well, for those who don't know Matt, just in fact for those who don't know who we are, I'm Ross Douthat.
Right.
I'm with The Atlantic, and I'm here with Matt Yglesias, formerly of The Atlantic as of 2 days ago. And why don't you?
Oh, yes. I had my last day at The Atlantic on Friday. I'll be starting a week from today at the Center for American Progress. But for this week, I guess I'm unemployed and lacking in grandiose titles or anything. But I still have my razor-sharp wit.
but now it's true. It's true that this week without blogging is the first week you've taken not the first week. Isn't it true that you haven't gone 24 hours without blogging in years?
Well, I hadn't since back in 2004. I'd at least once a day chimed in, even when I was on vacation or things like that. Because frankly, I like blogging. I mean, it's something I've been doing for my job, but I started doing it because it's fun. But I thought, for one thing, it just eases the transition technically, but also that it might be an interesting experiment to try and experience the world like a regular person instead of someone who's every thought goes out on the internet.
So what do you have to report so far? Have you come to any unique philosophical insights about?
No, I think it's actually just a declining quality of thoughts, since I know that other people won't. I don't need to be embarrassed by my opinions.
So you're just indulging in egregiously stupid thinking?
Yeah, I mean, and I've been really puzzling over why it is that you can't get funnel cake outside of an amusement park. That it seems like people should just sell it in the city.
That's
I don't know.
Oh man, I'm going to be thinking about that one all day.
Exactly, it's delicious. I went to King's Dominion on Saturday, and funnel cake is plentiful.
But this is the thing. See, if you'd blogged that question within 20 minutes, somebody would probably have emailed you or posted a comment explaining. There's probably some Byzantine regulatory scheme that prevents funnel cake from being sold.
You think the Jumbo Slice lobby is keeping funnel cake off of our?
It could be, or it's sort of an accidental, for instance, maybe funnel cakes used to be sold in brothels, and so they tried to regulate brothals by regulating
the brothels
cakes.
by using the funnel cakes, right?
And
it's possible.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, so enough blogging.
Okay.
Navel-gazing.
Enough about funnel cake.
Let's get down to business. Barack Obama. So you're. I've been really impressed with your brio, I guess.
I'm complacent. Is how I like to think of it.
Yeah, I mean, you just think Barack Obama's going to win, and you have a line that you've used in your blog repeatedly, which I think is a pretty effective line, where you sort of make fun of the people who are complaining or worrying that Barack Obama only has a sort of consistent 3 to 5 point lead in the polls, and you say the same people will presumably be complaining on November 15th when about
right, that he didn't win by enough. It's sort of a not that complicated thesis on my part. Obviously, he might lose. Things could happen, but he's been leading in the polls consistently, which to me indicates that unless something dramatic changes in the world, he's probably going to win. And I appreciate, particularly as a blogger, somebody who lives in this sort of hyperactive news cycle, that there's both a frustration among his fans and also a sense among his detractors that, McCain is doing a good job of, launching attacks and getting under his skin and something like that. But, at the end of the day, he's winning.
I actually think it's the reverse. I think it's that McCain, up until, I guess we can talk about whether whether the most recent batch of ads McCain has launched have been successful or not. But I think up till now there was sort of general consensus that McCain was running an astonishingly bad and flailing campaign. And so the fact that, with that going on, Barack Obama, it wasn't that, McCain was succeeding.
Okay, right, I see what you're saying, right. McCain, for a while, he was coming out with, web videos about his old teacher and was kind of sucking, and Obama didn't, pummel him or pull away.
Right.
And I mean, it's true, that didn't happen, and it may even be that, Obama made some kind of serious mistake and had a real opportunity there. But, I think what's interesting has just been how little movement there's been, regardless of this sort of shifting campaign tactics.
Yeah, and I've been sort of a sympathizer with the Yglesias view for a while. My working theory, which I've probably expressed on blogging heads before, but maybe not, is just that you have a situation where both candidates are weak in certain respects, and therefore each one has a ceiling on their potential support, which means that it actually wouldn't be that surprising if the race stayed sort of in this 3 to 5 point zone from here up until the election day, and ends, at which point Obama would win with 51 or 52% of the vote, which is...
But, I don't even think that says so much about particular weaknesses of the candidates. I think it's more just that the moment American politics has shifted into is one where, any candidate is going to face, I think, a substantial ceiling on their appeal that, a lot of people, particularly older people, but people who are not that old, were alive during a period of realignment and shifting partisan coalitions that allowed for these kind of huge landslide wins.
Right.
Because of real kind of just failures in the political marketplace to put forward two major party nominees, both of whom had a strong appeal to a huge block of people, but that in the modern era, I think you could get a big win when something happens like 1996, where a third party candidate kind of comes in the field and pulls down one of the side's votes. But I don't think you should expect anyone to get more than 52 or at the outside 53% of the vote, almost no matter what.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you've been linking. There are all these attempts to model the election,
right?
Using basically trying to exclude the candidates themselves and just using economic data on the popularity of the incumbent party, the popularity of the Democrats, and so on. And there was a wave of models that all seemed to argue. I think it was Alan Abramowitz had one. I'm misremembering this, no doubt, but that seemed to argue.
Yeah, it was Abramowitz and Larry Sabato came up with the one that was, I think, the most optimistic for Obama.
For Obama, right. But then there have been a couple that you've linked to that have said, no, he should... The optimistic ones were saying he should be getting, 55, 56% or something. And
and then the more pessimistic ones are more like 51, 52. It depends, obviously, on how much you weight George W. Bush's approval rating.
Right, as an incumbent.
As a
right.
factor in this. And obviously the fact that that's, it reminds you of how small the N is and how unlikely it is that you can really model this in a rigorous way.
Right.
I think qualitatively everybody agrees that in John McCain, the Republicans found a guy who is not associated in the sort of American imagination with being a George W. Bush loyalist. He's in a lot of ways best known for the fights he picked with George W. Bush in 1999 through 2003 or so. Which I think that tends to reinforce the more pessimistic case that, that to some extent Bush's unpopularity is going to hurt McCain, but it's not going to kill him the way it would if a George Bush successor figure were more clearly on the ballot.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. When I look at what McCain has been doing, I think the thing that always sort of baffles me from the point of view of sort of a McCain strategist is, I think it's, well, you can see that what McCain has sort of decided to do, I think, and at least this is my colleague Mark Ambender's point, is that he's decided to sort of go negative now, and presumably in the hopes that you tear down Obama now in in the summer, and then you can sort of build yourself up in the fall. I'm still I don't see how McCain builds himself up. I think that's the biggest challenge for him. It's actually not getting Obama, getting Obama's negatives higher and so on. I think it won't be that hard for him to do it. But I think McCain's ceiling, and I think you see this in poll after poll, it's just stuck at 45 to 46% of the vote.
Right. I do think that's the problem. I mean, there are these vulnerabilities with Barack Obama that, Hillary Clinton's campaign both tried to exploit and tried to point out to people. And I think it's, to some extent, relatively well understood. And there's only so kind of creative that the McCain campaign is going to get. This thing with Britney and whomever was... it was a little bit outside the box, but still, within the suite of, I think, the things he would say against Obama.
Right.
But, what is John McCain going to say about John McCain? They started early on trying to run sort of more positive pieces and doing that biography tour and stuff, and it was pretty lame. But, what they may be thinking is that they do this kind of campaign for now, and they do their fundraising, and then when they reach a point where they don't need sort of the loyalty and they don't need to appeal to the big kind of Bush bundlers, that they can roll out stuff that's more about McCain and him being independent and so on and so forth. I would think that's the explanation.
Yeah, I think that they, my sense is that they're just sort of generally blundering, and that in their blundering, I think it would have been easy to see the Britney Paris ad that everybody's talking about. When I first watched the ad, I thought, oh, this is just another stupid, blundering ad from a stupid, blundering, flailing campaign. And then that particular ad sort of seemed to knock Obama off his game in a way that earlier McCain ads hadn't. But it still doesn't get you to the point where you're... if you look at the polls, I think, the sort of tracking polls have showed the race tightening down to a tie or a 1 to 2 point Obama lead during this sort of whole kerfluffle about the Britney ad, and then about whether Obama played the race card by accusing McCain of playing the race card and so on. But none of those polls have seen McCain going up. It's just sort of more people becoming...
Obama fluctuates up and down, and people can be kind of scared off of him. But, part of the problem is not just a kind of a floundering issue, but, I imagine inside the McCain camp, right? Among the base of people who advise John McCain, who are important to John McCain, there must be, I think, substantial philosophical disagreements about the direction American public policy ought to go in. That, John McCain has changed positions on a lot of things and changed his political persona several times over the past 10 years. And, you can say that as, oh, he's a flip-flopper, he's evil, but there's also just a practical thing. When you talk about, people who are McCain enthusiasts, people who are McCain's close confidants, and those different people must have different visions of John McCain and visions of the United States of America in their head. That's part of what and there's infighting in all kinds of campaigns, but it gets worse when there are real principled disagreements among the people there as to, should the country be governed and should the country's energy policy be sort of orthodox conservative stuff, or was John McCain right to embrace a cap-and-trade program and say that, conservatives need to take global warming more seriously? And it's an inconsistency on McCain's own part, but it's also just a tension within his staff, and it makes it hard to formulate a positive message. It's easier to agree on making fun of Obama.
Yeah, my assumption with McCain all along... maybe not all along, but certainly, after his initial domestic policy rollout, at which point it became clear, I think, that this sort of, the absence of a coherent narrative and the fact that he seemed to be sort of trying to play to a lot of different factions, he's simultaneously running as a deficit hawk and as a tax cutter, and as a reformist in certain ways. Once that happened, my assumption was that the sort of the resume argument became McCain's strongest argument, that he and that he would essentially, and I guess you can sort of see that playing out a little bit in these ads about Obama as a celebrity and Obama as somebody who's sort of presumptuous and hasn't really accomplished anything and so on. But yeah, I mean maybe they'll sort of return to emphasizing McCain's own resume, which requires sort of emphasizing him as a maverick a bit more further along, but. Anyway, why don't we talk about Batman? How do you feel about that?
All right, Batman. I feel good about that.
Good, because there's only so far you can go with this kind of horse race conversation. So
no, I understand.
But we can pivot by talking about so Batman: The Dark Knight, the Christopher Nolan movie, is not only a huge critical and commercial hit, it's one of the biggest commercial hits in Hollywood history. In fact, it's on pace to. It's not going to catch Titanic, I don't think, but it's on pace to, probably exceed Star Wars and all of this, admittedly.
And has much more, sequel potential than Titanic.
That it does.
That's the genius. It's the problem with Titanic as a concept. The boat sinks, and
it's true.
There's really nothing else.
They could have gone on and made like the Lusitania and then the Andrea Dory
okay.
and
more shipwrecks, a whole shipwreck series, right?
And they could have, since Kate Winslet's character survived, she could have gone on and just happened to be. I mean, in the same way that John McClane in the Die Hard movies just sort of happens to be at the scene of multiple terrorist attacks.
It's a coincidence. But to be fair, starting with Die Hard 3, right? It's not a coincidence.
Right? No, they're going after him
to the hostages plot.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They want you to think they're going after him, thirsting for revenge, as a cover for a bank heist. It's important to get clear on this stuff.
And maybe that could be worked into the the Lusitania, like the Germans are trying to sink it because they know that Kate Winslet's by that point would be have become an American movie star or something. Anyway, to get back to the
Batman,
Dark Knight,
the genius of Batman, of course, what makes it work commercially is that it's just enough political themes so that serious political blogs and other new media. Enterprises can discuss it, and it's surveillance and terrorism and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, and the latest, the Dark Knight, I think, goes further than any of the previous Batman films, including Nolan's Batman Begins, which was itself sort of a step towards I guess realism to the extent that you can do sort of social realism in a comic book movie.
Right.
It was a step towards that and away from both the sort of gothic fantasia of Tim Burton and the just sort of crappiness of the Joel Schumacher movies. But this one goes, The Dark Knight takes it even a step further, where it is sort of, it's part superhero movie, part, urban crime melodrama in the age of terror. And so, I think there have actually been some really
and there's this very specific, conceptualization of the Joker as a terrorist,
right? Who
is sort of initially misunderstood by both other underworld figures and to some extent by the forces of law and order as a criminal, right? And Alfred is trying to get Batman to understand that that's sort of not really what they're up against. It's of course illegal to kill people, but that it's not a criminal enterprise in a conventional sense.
Right. No, and there's all the lines about some people keep talking about what does the Joker want, and Alfred says some men don't want anything. Some men just want to see the world burn, and he does this whole parallel to this essentially this South Asian. This terrorist in the jungle who was just robbing caravans for the sake of robbing them. And I mean, Andrew Klavan, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his last name, but he wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal saying that, The Dark Knight was an allegory for the Bush administration, where, Batman is basically George W. Bush, and the point of the movie is that, sometimes the heroic figure is the one who steps outside the law and sort of takes on, in fact, a lot of public scorn for doing so, but in the process does the necessary thing when you're up against the terrorist who simply isn't constrained by the kind of rules that our typical enemies are constrained by. And this piece got it was sort of roundly mocked on liberal blogs.
Well, the piece, I think it was the piece was a silly piece. It was written in a silly way, but I mean, I do think it captures some important truths. I mean, I think that definitely the movie expresses something about, I think, how people in the Bush administration see themselves and see what they're doing. And I mean, I wouldn't be shocked to learn that some of it was even, inspired by, like, Ron Suskind's account of what Dick Cheney thinks he's doing. Because it has a lot of resonance with things you hear from at least some of the sort of administration figures that, we need to walk on the dark side a little bit, I think was Cheney's line as they reported, and say that, somehow civilization and liberal democracy is actually too weak to withstand threats to itself, and so for the good of sort of American society and values, we need to do things that officially are judged unacceptable, and that, the really strong man sort of understands that he needs to take that hit to his reputation and do what needs to be done. That's, that's how Batman sees it, and I think it's probably how Bush sees himself.
Yeah, well, I think certainly it's how everything we know suggests that's how Cheney sees himself. But I think that those are, those are the politics of the movie to the extent the movie has politics. Now, the movie cheats a little bit, obviously, by sort of having, and I think this is sort of part of the broader problem with the movie, why it's not quite as great a movie as some people think it is, that, in the end, it is sort of a superhero movie, and that in the end, yes, Batman will sort of step outside the law, but he won't really step outside. I mean, he throws the Joker around an interrogation room, and then he does develop a device that allows him to somehow spy on all of Gotham, but he promises his aides that he will destroy the device as soon as the Joker is captured, and sure enough, he does destroy the device as soon as the Joker is captured. And and there's also the extent. I think the movie sort of plays it safe in other ways. I think that there's talk throughout the movie about what a terrible terrorist the Joker is and how he's completely terrorized Gotham and so on. But then if you look at actually like how many people he actually kills in the course of the movie and who they are, and he threatens to blow up a hospital, but then the hospital's actually evacuated before he blows it up, and then in the climactic scene, I won't be too spoilerish, but let's just say that the Joker's fiendish plot, if it succeeded, would be a really dark and horrifying capstone for the movie, but the plot does not, in fact, succeed because it is, in the end, a superhero movie. But
sure. But I do want to say, in terms of, is that the politics of the movie, right? I mean, one thing that sort of goes missing in the Bush's Batman kind of analysis is the character of Two-Face, right? I mean, that there's a character in the film who sort of goes further than Batman does, who believes even more so, in a very strong sense, that somehow the rules are useless, and that the world kind of doesn't make sense anymore in this age of terror, and that we need to use more brutal measures than Batman is willing to take, and that person is clearly not a heroic figure in the film. Whereas on the contrary, there are other sort of sympathetic people who take a less kind of hard line than Batman throughout the whole thing. So I think, like, as tends to happen with a well-made movie, a well-made movie that has some, resonances with what's happening, people watch it, and then you come away with it, still thinking the thing you thought before, and seeing these themes kind of illustrated, right? I mean, on one level, to say, okay, Batman is having an appropriate reaction to a, masked supervillain, and that this is what George W. Bush thinks we're up against, is a figure like the Joker, rather than an actual terrorist organization with political objectives. I think that it sort of leaves it pretty open-ended, what you're supposed to make of the real world.
Sure. I mean, and it's true that, there is a strain that, wants to portray, a strain in conservative thought that wants to portray both Bin Ladenism specifically, and then sort of the broader jihadi tendency in the Islamic world as sort of purely nihilistic, rather than as a political movement that sort of has a certain amount. I mean, there is obviously a certain kind of nihilism woven into any ideology that places such a high emphasis on suicide and death. But it's true that the Joker deliberately refuses to have any. Yeah, he has no political object. I mean, he's an Iago figure essentially. He's sort of evil, untrammeled.
And the idea that he just wants to watch the world burn is important, thematically to the understanding there. And I mean, I don't. You could think that about Osama Bin Laden or about broader Islamist political movements, but I don't think that's a correct understanding of them. And it shows real limits. I mean, especially in the sort of the tendency among conservatives to think of a very sort of broad, Islamist problem rather than a narrow one. And it's just not the case that there's a movement of millions of people around the world, including Al Qaeda, but also the government of Iran and Saddam Hussein and so on and so forth, and that all those people just want to watch the world burn. But that's, I think, what George W. Bush says about the world, and it's false.
Well, is that exactly what Bush says about the world? I think that, I think you could argue that there exists a broad-based movement that does want to see the world burn in order to achieve certain political objectives, and I don't know if you would extend that to include the government of Iran or not, but there is a sense in which sort of the broad Islamist project is a project that's dependent in some sense on the sort of collapse of the existing world order, which is different. I mean, which is distinct from the Joker's goal, which is just to bring about the collapse of the current world order for its own sake.
Well, and specifically, right, I mean, the Joker wants to make people do things that are, like, morally perverse, right?
Right.
He wants to show up their value systems as somehow, hollow and hypocritical and things that they will abandon or be forced to abandon. Which is an interesting idea for sort of, building tension in your film, but doesn't seem likely to me that that's, like really what's going on with anyone. That, whether or not we experience certain decisions about trade-offs in an age of terror as those kind of conflicts. I mean, it's not literally the purpose of terrorist attacks to like force us to face painful dilemmas about how much surveillance should exist.
Sure. I mean, I guess though one question would be when you have a movement who and here I agree it's important to distinguish Al Qaeda from the mullahs in Iran for the most part, and from other terrorist groups in the Middle East that have sort of more explicit and, in some cases, attainable political objectives. But Al Qaeda itself, when you're dealing with an organization whose stated objectives are, in some sense, fantastical,
right?
I mean, how it's true that they are different from the Joker, who has no stated objectives. But in practice, attacking the World Trade Center in an effort to bring America to its knees is not so wildly different from the stuff the Joker attempts in the film, and in fact, it's a much more serious. I mean, again, this goes back, I think, to some of the sort of limits that the movie places on itself. But nothing the Joker does in the movie compares to what Al Qaeda managed to pull off on 9/11. I mean, I think the broader question in terms of whether Dick Cheney's view of the world is right is not a question about whether Osama Bin Laden has the value system of a supervillain, but whether Osama Bin Laden has the capabilities of a supervillain. I mean, I think, the debate about Cheneyism is ultimately a debate about how serious the threat we face really is.
Well, okay, but to stand up for the seriousness of the threat coming from the Joker, right? I mean, part of what I think you see in the movie and you see in the real world is that the ability to pull off the sort of targeted killings of key kind of personnel is in some ways more threatening to the social fabric than the sheer scale.
Yeah, no, that's true.
On 9/11. That I mean, obviously, it's I mean, it's a tragedy every time one person is murdered, and when you have 3,000 dead, I mean, that's horrible. But the country, in a literal sense, bounces back from that, no problem. When you feel that sort of key political leaders can be plausibly blackmailed by terrorists, right? I mean, that calls a lot of things into doubt in a way that the destruction of a large office building doesn't. And speaks to other issues just in the films in general, right? That at the beginning of the series, there's no confidence whatsoever in the efficacy of the public institutions in Gotham City. And Batman is simultaneously trying to rebuild that confidence and rebuild those institutions while sort of paradoxically operating outside of them.
Right.
And what the Joker does, even though the body count is low, is supposed to be a setback to that enterprise.
Right, no, and it's true, I can see the point, especially since, I mean, the Joker does, in fact, say that explicitly, I think, at one point in the movie. He talks about how, the key to terror is to confound people's expectations, because people, if a criminal gets killed, people expect criminals to get killed, I mean, if a judge
Well, and he says
killed,
if a truck full of soldiers dies, no... It's not that nobody cares, but people expect.
But it doesn't. Right, it doesn't. And this goes to the off-sided point about the fact that a terrorist organization that was more effective than Al Qaeda and also interested in bringing the U.S. to its knees would have done well, in the aftermath of 9/11 to have found a way to follow up with very small scale targeted attacks throughout the United States, and
right.
that in fact this is why the anthrax attacks, which are obviously in the news right now, were so actually had such a profound effect on sort of
right.
how we experienced the aftermath of 9/11, because it did feel like terrorism could become an everyday thing. So, in that sense, I agree. The Joker does.
Well, and I mean, even very specifically, right? Like, as the Joker says, like, more Americans have been killed sort of fighting Bush's, war in Iraq than were killed on 9/11. But because those people who've been killed were most overwhelmingly soldiers ordered into battle as part of a official policy, right? I mean, that doesn't have nearly the psychological impact on the public or the political consciousness of people just being killed in an office building somewhere, right? I mean, there's just a difference between that kind of fear versus the idea that people who have sort of risky jobs inherently
right.
and are being sent into violent situations may be killed.
Yeah, no, I agree. But what was my original? Oh, just that. Yeah, I mean, I guess it does come back to sort of the 1% doctrine sort of stands or falls on the gravity of the threat, and I mean in the context of The Dark Knight, nobody questions the fact, or almost, I mean, obviously Batman's aides question the fact, but when he assumes the power to surveil everyone in Gotham City, it's in the context of an ongoing emergency where
right.
you have to apprehend the Joker because he is going to kill again, within the next 12 to 24 hours. And so the debate over whether that's an appropriate tack to take over the long run, ultimately depends on the extent to which it is possible that at any moment there will be another 9/11 style attack.
Right. Well, and just on the handling of it, over the long haul. I mean, one of the nice things about a movie, for these purposes, it just kind of ends nice and cleanly. And you don't get the kind of the messy aftermath where things that were undertaken as emergency measures
right.
now, if you were to stop them, well, it would come out that you did it, and there might be trouble and blah blah blah. Life is difficult.
Right. Well, and speaking of sort of long term challenges and 1% doctrines, you had a really interesting post, I thought, the other day about something related to this, which was, well, why don't you summarize it? You were
right. Okay. Well, so Paul Krugman was writing about global warming and the sort of the need to take into account small probabilities of total disaster.
Right.
Which I think there's controversy over the extent to which there's a probability of total disaster. But, in theory, people accept that a 1% chance that everyone will die is, an important thing to keep in mind, even though probably we won't.
Right.
And so I've been in a comic booky mood because there was a preview for Watchmen attached to Dark Knight. And if you read Watchmen, which is a work written in the 1980s, and if you're familiar in general with the great comic books of the 80s, you'll see that there was a lot of anxiety at that time about nuclear war, and specifically, most people, obviously most Americans, voted for Ronald Reagan, voted for his reelection, but it was a common sentiment among people who didn't like him that his policies were running an unacceptable risk of nuclear war and of kind of bringing the world to an end. And just, when you think about probabilities, it's possible that Reagan really did elevate the risk of total global destruction to nuclear war, and also that the things he did in the actual world worked out fine. And so, a lot of the proponents, a lot of Reagan's antagonists at that time, I think, look kind of silly in retrospect with these overblown warnings, we're all going to die, we're all going to die. But really to say, well, we're going from a 1% chance of everyone dying to a 5% chance of everyone dying, it seems like a pretty serious policy mistake, even if it kind of works out in the end.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic, actually. I think, and it doesn't just have to do with Reagan. It has to do with obviously the whole of American policy throughout the Cold War, which I think we've all sort of made a decision, now that it's over, to almost not think about it too hard. Sort of what.
Well, to decide that it worked out in the end.
Right, but the position, the
enough.
sort of more, in a sense, the moral position that we were placed in, where we were constantly having to sort of choose policies on, you had sort of two overlapping calculuses, and one calculus was, we need to, minimize the risk of an actual nuclear war, and the other calculus is, you have to balance that against the demands of, both the national interest and sort of demands of justice, broadly speaking, because clearly, the way to reduce the likelihood of nuclear war to zero would have been for the United States to sort of surrender itself to the Soviet Union and sort of allow some kind of, global communist empire. Not that would have been, not that was ever in the cards, but you can see, if you're
well, I mean, it's
about
actually oddly unclear what surrender could have even consisted of.
That's right.
In that regard, I mean, part of what made it tricky, right, was precisely the fear that if your adversary knew that you were so averse to an elevated risk of conflict that you would back down, that would encourage your adversary to push forward.
Elevate the risk of conflict, right.
Right, and thereby elevate the risk of conflict, and to some extent, you could minimize the risk of conflict by appearing to be the more risk-friendly partner.
Well, right, and this was Nixon's. I mean, this was sort of a variant on Nixon's famous mad bomber strategy, where the idea was if the Soviets thought that they, couldn't possibly know what we were going to do. And I mean, this is my provisional opinion on your point about Reagan, is just that, it was a case where, over the long run, a policy that seemed in the short run to elevate the risk because only that policy had the potential to dramatically reduce the risk in the long run. That if you're playing probabilities, that actually balances out favorably. That taking the line that Reagan took, and I mean, obviously it's easy to say in hindsight, but I think, there was a sense in which he was vindicated because, the effect of Reagan's policies was to reduce the risk of nuclear war, let's say from, 2% to 0.2% or so. I mean, clearly there was a huge reduction in risk gained by policies that perhaps in the short run, and with the flip side being, taking the sort of peaceful coexistence line that dominated U.S. thinking during the Douthat era, clearly reduced the risk of nuclear war in that era in the short run, but again, at the cost of, sort of perpetuating an environment of sort of where, hair trigger risks and so on were a much bigger thing. But I mean, it is, especially, and I know you have very different views on the matter, but I mean, coming as I do out of the sort of Catholic-oriented, just war tradition theory of international relations, how you apply that kind of thinking to the nuclear age, I think, is an intensely vexing question, and one that I think people sort of have sort of ducked away from because we sort of muddled through okay.
Right.
But if you look at like the decisions that were taken in the 50s, for instance, again, there was this sort of calculus on Eisenhower's part, I think, and again, this is not my area of expertise, so I may be getting this wrong, but that, essentially that, a massive, this was sort of his initial calculation, and it tied into sort of
with
fears about
massive,
the military
massive
industrial
retaliation.
Sorry?
Was that just a big nuclear arsenal and
right.
a blanket threat of massive retaliation would sort of suffice to deter things, and you could actually do without a kind of huge
right, and that this would simultaneously then reduce the risk, because clearly a conventional war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, however,
had a lot of risks to go.
Had a lot of risks too, and having just come through the experience of World War II, you could argue, getting up to the 3% risk of massive destruction outweighs. World War II was massive destruction in its own right too. But I guess I don't really have a big point here except to say that.
Sure. Well, I'll just say, I think that to some extent the argument I kind of put forward there in defense of Reagan's critics is a little unfair to just to the reality of the policies Reagan was pursuing, which were not, the actual policies he was implementing were not the policies sort of as caricatured by his critics, and that particularly after 83 or so, I believe, the evidence suggests that Reagan was actually very kind of attuned to these problems and interested both in victory, so to speak, as you put it, but also in trying to pursue at least the option of denuclearization between existing superpowers. And, that was something he would sort of come with at the bargaining table at the Reykjavik summit and elsewhere was a double zero option. And, oriented it so that eliminating the chance of the world being destroyed in nuclear conflict was the main goal, and that there were several different modalities by which that could be pursued, which ultimately included both some arms control treaties and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. But these were things he was aware of, and it's sort of an amusing twist. It turns out, the specific plot of Watchmen, to spoil it for everyone, is the idea that a faked alien invasion of Earth would cause the superpowers to come together and eliminate the threat of war. And it's come out, I believe, since the publication of the book that Reagan was actually given to musing on this topic, at least at one point to Mikhail Gorbachev, which prompted Colin Powell to try to reel him in, lest he get too weird.
Yeah, Reagan was really good at those kind of musings.
Right.
Yeah, I have to say, since you've gone into the spoilers on Watchmen, I just actually read Watchmen for the first time. I'm not a graphic novel enthusiast, but I thought that with the movie now coming out, and since it is supposed to be the greatest graphic novel of all time and so on, that I should sit down and actually read the thing. And right. I have to say, and I understand they're changing the ending somewhat in the movie. I think they are, but I have to say, I thought the ending was totally wildly unpersuasive. Just because, and this is again, stop listening if you don't want things spoiled.
Sure.
But so at the end of Watchmen, right? So the whole idea is that one of the superheroes in the movie has developed this plan where he will genetically engineer an alien life form with telepathic powers, right? And then teleport it into the heart of New York, and as it dies, its immense telepathic powers will wipe out, several million New Yorkers or something.
Right.
And
leading to a waning of Cold War tensions.
Right, thus creating a waning of Cold War tensions. And, I knew going in, because of other people's spoilers, that a faked alien invasion was going to be the Deus Ex Machina that came at the end of the book. I was sort of expecting it, though, to be, an actual faked alien invasion, as opposed
Better
to...
faked.
Right, I mean, as opposed to what, at the end of the comic book, they have people saying, well, we think that this was just the equivalent of like an alien bee sort of floating into our space and stinging everyone before it dies and so on. And I think that kind of thing, the sort of random appearance of an alien life form, it would create a sort of shock to the system that would ratchet down tensions between the superpowers, but it would be completely unsustainable as a sort of basis for conciliation. I mean, obviously, a faked alien invasion has its own set of problems because then you actually have to sustain the invasion too.
Produce the aliens, right? But so I mean, a few points, right? I mean, one thing is that I think like Ozymandias's plot needs to be a little bit harebrained and implausible in order to bring the right kind of I think complexity to the issue, right? That I think the reaction, like, wait, this is stupid, it couldn't possibly work, is supposed to be a kind of a plausible response to it. Then on another level, it's just because for better or for worse, right? I mean, the whole book is really invested in this sort of complicated intertextuality and so on and so forth that ends with the idea that he has, kidnapped comic book writers to help design his monster, specifically like the writer of the
comic book that's woven in throughout the...
Yeah, I think that to some extent all that stuff is like a little less brilliant than it's sometimes said to be.
That's my, as a non-graphic novel person, that was my impression of the book as a whole. It was that, if this is the pinnacle of the art, I'm still not that impressed with the art, but...
Yeah, and to some extent, I think that's the right impression that, if the most sophisticated thing you can do with the graphic novel format is this very self-referential thing that says a lot of sophisticated stuff about the medium.
Right.
But that to really appreciate any of that or care about it, you need to waste like tons and tons of time reading stuff that's like schlocky and less good. Then you sort of wonder what's the point. I love comic books, so like I think Watchmen is really neat, but it's certainly not. It's not good enough to say, well, okay, now you should go back and like read all this other crap just so that you get all the in-jokes. Shakespeare is like worth trying to understand, even though it's difficult to a modern person, and Watchmen isn't. I think.
Well, I'll be very interested to see what the movie is like. I guess that. I think they are setting it in the 80s and sort of keeping the whole alternative timeline, Richard Nixon re-elected as president 5 times and so on. So, and I think that's a good thing. I think because the alternative would be to update it with, and with ecological catastrophe instead of nuclear war, which is how everything gets updated, which actually gets back, and this can be the last thing we talk about, but
sure.
to the
ecological catastrophe.
Well, we can circle back to the Krugman point, because the Krugman column arguing about sort of the 1% risk of ecological catastrophe and so on. And I'm curious what you think about that, because it is something that you hear a lot from sort of global warming alarmists and so on. And I'm not quite sure what I think about the argument myself. I guess I should sit down and read Richard Poster's book on catastrophe and some other things before I venture an opinion. But it does seem like it's interesting that you have a situation where the American left is invested, or at least precincts of it are invested in the idea that we need dramatic action on climate change to avert this sort of 1% to 5% possibility of total catastrophe. And then on the other hand, you have, on the American right, you have sort of Dick Cheney and that whole sort of circle invested in the idea that the exact same thing is true, but it's the kind of action we need is action to avert the 1% possibility of, nuclear Armageddon on American soil.
Right. There's a somewhat of a failure of a parallel, though, just in that I don't think many liberals are prepared to concede that the policies the Bush administration has pursued, actually are extreme but effective counterterrorism measures. But I do think it shows, right? Invoking supreme emergency is, of course, a effective rhetorical tactic and an effort to, close things down. And in particular, when you can use, infinity as the numerator in your calculations, and then tell people, well, actually, no matter how, unlikely A, B, or C, event is, that can be sort of a strong weapon, or at least people can think it's a strong weapon. I don't think that those kind of appeals to small possibilities actually persuade anyone. All the research indicates that in practice people just ignore small probabilities, but it seems like a good way of trying to get people to do things they don't want to do.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's definitely part of its appeal. It's interesting though with you have sort of I don't know what was your take on Al Gore's speech, which seemed his recent speech about what we need to do in the next 10 years to fight climate change and so on. Which it seemed to me that was invested in the sort of Krugman paradigm.
Yeah, I'm not. I think that this kind of catastrophism is a little bit of a blind alley. I think that what you want to say is that there's a problem, it's desirable to take action, and then you want to start identifying actions that can be taken that you think you can persuade people, hopefully because it's true, will in fact not be extremely costly. And say we should do that stuff. We should pick up the low-hanging fruit, and the low-hanging fruit will reduce emissions somewhat, will be a down payment, lay the groundwork for international diplomacy, blah, blah, blah. And, people can continue kind of collecting data. But, since in the real world it's obviously a problem that crosses national borders and requires, a global solution, by its nature, the outcome will be the outcome of a process will probably be slow, and there's no real point in kind of sitting in Al Gore's living room and drawing up, this is what we need to do next year, because we're not going to do what Al Gore thinks we're going to need to do next year. And rather than trying to sort of frighten people into doing something that we know isn't going to happen, you need to try and persuade people that there are things we can do that, will not be as costly as people fear.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. I guess the big question is whether those things. I guess the sort of, and again, you're right. It's an imperfect analogy. I guess the sort of counter, the liberal claims about Cheneyism are different from the conservative claims about liberal environmental policies. Even though there are some conservative claims that are sort of similar, that are essentially saying, look, this is sort of, it's, the conservative line on global warming is that it's saying we're doing ourselves huge harm for very small returns.
Right.
And you could cast the liberal critique of Cheneyism in a similar way. I don't think hardly any opponent of, wiretapping, detention, interrogation, whatever aspect of those policies you pick. It's clear that in some cases, some of those policies could have some impact on terrorism. You could interrogate someone harshly.
No, I think the claim would be more that things like invading Iraq and, other aspects of Bush's policies have been directly counterproductive. But, this is what makes it difficult in all cases, right? Part of the essence of the global warming debate, right, is that people have independent disagreements about the desirability of certain kind of measures, right? There are a lot of people who think, it would be better, it would be healthier and more ethical for people to eat less meat and adopt, if not all become vegetarians or vegans, to at least cut down on their consumption of animal proteins. Other people disagree with that, but, from that point of view, of course, then, measures that do that reduce global warming, are not really costs at all. It's sort of benefits.
Right.
And this is
And
why
similarly,
it becomes very tangled. Similarly with cars and transportation policy.
Right.
And I mean, of course, that's politics for you, right? I mean, there's sort of endless kind of contested
right,
values.
but I mean, it's true that doesn't. You see fewer. I mean, there is. Even the most sort of pro-torture precincts of the right, are still sort of arguing that it's. That it's a necessary evil, rather than saying, isn't it a nice side benefit of the war
that we get to torture, right?
That we get to torture.
I think you see it. I think you get a closer parallel, not with the interrogation and surveillance policies, but with the sort of foreign policy in a more traditional sense. Where administration officials would tell you that invading Iraq was a precautionary measure. Liberals would say it was like shooting ourselves in the foot. I think you can argue that there's a certain desire among certain precincts, for kind of war and conflict sort of as such, or at least to have reasons for us to knock off bad guys.
That
the public
I think the real
otherwise
dovetailing would be, there are people who are invested in, sort of American power, call it American imperialism, call it what you want, and they also happen to think that will make us safer from terrorism. But
yeah. Well, and I mean, look, there was a lot of sentiment, and to some extent it was bipartisan sentiment in the 90s, that the United States ought to be pursuing a more aggressive foreign policy, but that the sort of slovenly and sheep-like voters, weren't really interested in the Balkans or whatever to an adequate degree. And something like 9/11 is, if you accept that point of view, like an opportunity to persuade people to accept a more activist role in the world. In a way that's, I think parallel to people's sort of desire to use the climate issue to put additional weight behind stuff that they thought was the right thing to do before. They ever watched Al Gore's movie.
Right. Okay. Well, we've gotten pretty meta, and just sort of
Sweet.
establishing parallels. So why don't we call it a day? Thanks so much for talking to me, Matt. I'll miss having you around the office, but it's good to know I can always
Sure.
Talk
Virtual
to you on Blogging
conference
Heads.
call dialogue. Yes. All right.
Take care.